It is such a treat to share this Shabbat with so many of our regulars who were here when we were pre-COVID in celebration. And again, a thanks to Amy and Carl. As it turned out, being the second Shabbat of the month, and next month will be the second Shabbat, it is Yismechu, which means that we have Carl on musical accompaniment, just adding to Amy's singing and to our praying, so that this morning feels truly celebratory of CBI at its best. But it's not quite CBI at its best, because what was always emblematic of CBI was our participation in Torah services. And I am happy to see Mike Baer, among others, in our courtyard, who consistently helped arrange in recent years 180 different Torah readers from our community in our triennial cycle. It's truly what is distinctive about CBI, but we're not reading Torah during this period because of the complications of physical distancing and creating a flow for you who are our largest audience week after week, and that's you who are at home with us in this sacred space, joining and creating a larger sacred space. So this is an opportunity to share not only with those in the courtyard outside on this beautiful morning, but with all of us, wherever you are, coming and expanding our sense of CBI and sacred space. Our Torah reading this morning is about transition. Hayei Sarah provides the death of Sarah at the outset. And in that regard, this is a Shabbat for us to honor Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who passed last Saturday. This is still the period of his Shiva. And I want to pay tribute to one of the great teachers of our day by reading some of his own words. For in the weekly mailings that I receive from Rabbi Sachs, it says in the introduction for the mailing this week that Rabbi Sachs had prepared a full year of Divrei Torah based on a book that he wrote called Lessons in Leadership. And those were Torah teachings for this year of 5781. And in that sense, we learn in the Talmud that even when a great sage has died, his lips continue to move from the grave. Those are the words of the Talmud. When we hear the words repeated of that sage. So a little bit about Rabbi Sachs and then linking it with Hayei Sarah. Rabbi Sachs was that remarkable hybrid, which perhaps is part of what made him who he was. Namely, he was somebody who had a deep secular education, and within the Orthodox world, that's unusual. He studied both at Cambridge and Oxford, received a doctorate in philosophy, and had a turning point in part with a visit to the Rabbi in New York. The enormous impact of Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the teacher who's also one of the great teachers of our generation, was engaged with a young man still in college and said to Rabbi Sachs, who was considering a career in academics, "You need to be a teacher of Israel." And he writes movingly of that meeting with the Rebbe as a transformative moment for him. And he would begin his immersion in Jewish studies at a relatively late age for somebody who would go on to become such an important teacher for the Orthodox community. And you have to understand that in London, in Britain, the Beit Din, the rabbinic court, is exceedingly conservative with a small c. I was in London close to 15 years ago, staying with one of the continuing great London teachers, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, when reading the local Jewish paper, learned that the conversions done in Israel by Rabbi Duchman, who had been the modern Orthodox rabbi who was the highest ranking rabbi in the army, had done a number of conversions, both for soldiers and for others, and had converted a woman whose children wanted to attend the day school in England, and her conversion was rejected by the Beit Din, saying that Rabbi Duchman wasn't quite up to their standards. So I mention that to say that the Beit Din of England was, and so Rabbi Sachs would go on and be appointed with that Beit Din as over his shoulder in his years as chief rabbi of England. And he did so continuing to use the knowledge that he had gained in his studies of world philosophy, anthropology, psychology, sociology, and history. I am deeply moved to know that this week Prince Charles paid tribute to Rabbi Sachs as an important friend and teacher of morality. One of the great peers of Rabbi Sachs, who was a close friend, is Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo, who lives in Jerusalem, another philosopher rabbi, who said in an obituary this week for Rabbi Sachs, Jews were called to be a light unto the nations, presenting moral guidance, but all too often became no more than nightlights, seeking to comfort those around them, afraid of controversy. Let me comfort you rather than challenge you. And as I read that, I am, of course, also always reading it with the lens of my own role and responsibility. And he said, Rabbi Lopez Cardozo of Rabbi Sachs, that where other peers sought and aspired to be head of a yeshiva, talking only among ourselves of the past, Rabbi Sachs had the confidence and moral calling to debate with the great philosophers of his day about the nature of religion, and had an ability to connect with people of all faiths. Because one of the things that Rabbi Sachs wrote so brilliantly about was the wisdom of other faiths and the opportunity to engage in interfaith dialogue. What's quite remarkable for me in the study of Rabbi Sachs, and you know this last high holidays, I used his book on morality as an opportunity to teach his wisdom and to create a moral challenge for all of us, to see our world through the eyes of we, rather than only through I. For his critique of Western civilization in our day is that it has moved toward the sense of I, my rights, rather than the sense of our interdependent relationship and responsibility to each other. And what was remarkable about the book Morality is how little Torah there was in it. Torah in the sense of he wasn't teaching Judaism as such, but it was Judaism and the teachings of Torah that gave him the role and responsibility to read and present the larger culture of history and philosophy and psychology and critique it as the failure to own responsibility to each other as the true lens of a moral perspective. And it was with that as a lens that he critiques those who don't wear a mask, because I don't feel comfortable. And it was easier for me to have him critique as a moral issue than for me. Because after all, Rabbi, I've heard this. Comfort us, my people. That was what made Rabbi Sacks the great man that he was, though remarkably and in many ways. And this links to Hayei Sarah. His greatness only blossomed after he stopped being the chief rabbi of England, at least for me, because then he was freed up not to look over his shoulder so much at the Beit Din and others who said, Rabbi, don't get political, and allowed him to become the moral conscience, because he made a distinction between politics and morality. That's a big part of the book Morality. That the role of a teacher of Israel, is to be an emissary of Abraham, teaching about kindness, saying to God, "Ashofet kol haaretz lo yaseh mishpat," the judge of the earth will not do justly, that even God is accountable to rights and wrongs, that there are embedded in creation itself a sense of right and wrong, and a sense of a calling to see the world through God's eyes, not just through our own individual immediate needs. And so when he stopped being the chief rabbi of Israel about 15 years ago, his writings became effusive. He has such a legacy so that even in this moment, we can read a Dvar Torah that has never been heard before, because he prepared for the entire year. And he writes in that regard of Abraham. And he writes of Abraham a little bit from the beginning of the Dvar Torah. A while back, a British newspaper, The Times, interviewed a prominent member of the Jewish community and a member of the House of the Lords. Let's call him Lord X. On his 92nd birthday, the interviewer said, most people, when they reach their 92nd birthday, start thinking about slowing down. You seem to be speeding up. Why? Lord X's reply was this: when you get to 92, you see the door starting to close, and I have so much to do before the door closes that the older I get, the harder I have to work. And indeed, as I noted, Rabbi Sacks, when he retired as chief rabbi, then began to write and write and write. He had cancer twice already in his life at that point, and he would pass from cancer. And perhaps part of his sense of focus was that his years were limited. And he points out in the Dvar Torah that once Sarah dies, his beloved wife, Abraham gets busy. He acquires the first piece of land, that of the cave of Machpelah. He gets busy. He sends his servant to find a wife for his son. He continues to engage the world around him. And so he writes, that is what leaders understand. What changes the world, what fulfills our destiny, is not what God does for us, but what we do for God. Leaders take responsibility for creating the conditions through which God's purposes can be fulfilled. They are not passive but active, even in old age, like Abraham in this week's Parsha. Indeed, in the chapter immediately following the story of finding a wife for Isaac, to our surprise, we read that Abraham remarries and has 8 more children. Whatever else this tells us, and there are many interpretations, it certainly conveys the point that Abraham stayed young the way Moses stayed young. Quote, his eyes were undimmed and his natural energy unabated. Though action takes energy, it gives us energy. The contrast between Noah in old age and Abraham in old age could not be greater. Perhaps, though, the most important point of this parsha is that large promises, a land, countless children, become real through small beginnings. Leaders begin with an envisioned future, but they also know that there is a long journey between here and there. We can only reach it one act at a time, one day at a time. There is no miraculous shortcut, and if there were, it would not help. The use of a shortcut would culminate in an achievement like Jonah's gourd, which grew overnight, then died overnight. Abraham acquired only a single field and had just one son who would continue this covenant. Yet he did not complain, and he died serene and satisfied because he had begun, because he had left future generations something on which to build. All great change is the work of more than one generation, and none of us will live to see the full fruit of our endeavors. Leaders see the destination, begin the journey, and leave behind those who will continue it. That is enough to endow a life with immortality. Ribono Shalom, Master of the universe, we honor the memory of a great teacher in our midst, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. We are taught that when a great teacher passes, it is as if a light was extinguished, and that you too, God, feel an absence. Hence the need to say Yitkadal, to fill in that light in order to comfort you. May you be comforted, may we be comforted, for we know that the words of Rabbi Sachs will endure, that what he began as a teacher will continue to be taught. May we rise to know that all knowledge, wherever it may be found, is God's knowledge, to be learned and taught, and we know that it is our chance and opportunity, each of us, to be leaders to those around us with moral conscience. Amen.